Hi, I'm Catherine Lynch, the Director of the Freedom Project, and today we are delighted to welcome Professor Bradley Campbell, a distinguished sociologist from California State University, Los Angeles. Bradley Campbell focuses broadly on the subject of moral conflict. He has written two influential and important books, one on genocide, published in 2015 by the University of Virginia Press, and most recently the book that inspired this lecture, The Rise of Victimhood Culture, Microaggressions, Safe Spaces, and the New Culture Wars, co-authored with Jason Manning, and out from Palgrave Macmillan in 2018. He is also the author of many journal and magazine articles and book chapters that reach across such varying, compelling topics as terrorism, genocide, plea bargaining, or the campus culture wars, tolerance, and microaggressions. His writing is characterized by the unusual ability to step back from a confusing and highly charged landscape of disagreement to introduce a new framework that suddenly recasts and clarifies discussion, as he does with the important distinctions between honor, dignity, and victimhood cultures. We are really lucky and honored to start off our lecture series this year with Professor Campbell discussing dignity in an era of victimhood and incivility.
Thank you. It's great to be here, and I've had a good time looking around the campus, a very beautiful campus. It's nice being here in the fall, getting a break from the LA weather at this time. I had a wonderful lunch with the Adam Smith Fellows this afternoon, and I'm just really excited to be here. To the extent that I've been critical about a lot of recent trends at college campuses, it's because I'm concerned that they're undermining all the good things that colleges and universities do and still do, and so it's always nice to visit campuses and see some of those good things, like the Freedom Project, which I'm enjoying hearing about. So I'm really honored to be here, and thanks for having me. So I want to talk today about incivility at universities, but also in other areas of public life. And I want to talk about the sources of incivility. One source is the expansion of what I call victimhood culture, and as we'll see, when moral cultures depart from what sometimes has been called a culture of dignity, this can lead to incivility. It can also lead to threats to free speech and academic freedom. That can occur on campuses, but when there are departures from dignity outside of campuses, it has similar effects. So incivility might be rudeness, it might be insults, mockery, hate speech, other kinds of speech and behavior that direct contempt toward other people. And I think that if we start thinking about incivility in public life, what comes to mind a lot is politics. So this is from NPR. This is a poll last year asking Americans how concerned they are that the negative tone in civility in Washington will lead to violence. And if you add the concerned and the very concerned here, you see that 79% are concerned. So that's a large majority, and it's across party lines. So 90% of Democrats, 70% of Republicans, and 79% of independents are concerned about incivility. So a lot of people are worried, but they don't agree about whose fault it is. 29% blamed the media, 17% blamed congressional Democrats, 7% blamed Republicans, and 40% blamed Donald Trump. So a lot of disagreement, but also a lot of people blaming Trump. I think if you're talking about Trump, what a lot of people have in mind are the tweets. So Trump's Twitter account. So Trump's opponents, and actually even many of his supporters, have referred to his tweets as uncivil, as unpresidential, and many of those tweets involve insults. So here's a tweet about Omarosa Manigault-Newman, who had criticized Trump after she lost her job at the White House. And Trump here calls her a dog. Here he is calling Secretary of State, former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, dumb as a rock. Joe Biden is a low IQ individual. The mayor of London is a stone-cold loser. The mayor of New York is very dumb and incompetent. So that's Trump, but of course it's not just Trump who's insulting people over Twitter. Here's another example. This is Jerry Falwell Jr., who's president of Liberty University and a big supporter of Trump, actually. You see here a response to a tweet from the Baptist minister Russell Moore. Now, Moore's tweet calls for people created in the image of God to be treated with dignity and compassion. And he says, he's saying this in the context of immigration, and he says we can do better in the way we treat migrant children at the border. And you see how Falwell responds, "You're nothing but an employee and a bureaucrat." So incivility about political matters doesn't just come from Trump, but also doesn't just come from other Republicans. So we see here Democratic Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib calling for Trump's impeachment using a vulgar term. We've also seen left-wing activists confront Republicans and Trump supporters while they're out eating meals, while they're going to movies, and things like this. So here's Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi. She was heckled when she went to go see Mr. Rogers, the film. And here's Hillary Clinton saying, "You cannot be civil with a political party that wants to destroy what you stand for." Okay, so if we see this kind of incivility in politics, it's not a big surprise that we're also seeing it among political activists at universities, whether this is students, whether it's faculty sometime, whether it's administrators who take part in politics. But at universities, it tends more often to take a particular form. It involves accusations of oppression and harm. And sometimes this is over what to outsiders might seem pretty mild disagreements with the activist. And then activists direct insults and hostility toward those they see as oppressors. They often demand that they be fired. So Nicholas Christakis is a professor at Yale. He and his wife Erica were the heads of one of the residential colleges there. The dean's office sent out an email warning people about wearing offensive Halloween costumes. So Erica, in her capacity as the head of this residential college, sent out an email just questioning whether this was something the university needed to be involved in, or whether maybe this is something that students could handle themselves. The response from many students was anger. Some of them confronted Nicholas and surrounded him on campus, cursed at him, accused him and Erica also of racism, of stripping people of their humanity, of creating an unsafe space. And they later resigned their position as heads of the residential college, although Nicholas is still a tenured professor at Yale. Brett Weinstein ran afoul of campus activists at Evergreen State College when he questioned an event called the Day of Absence. So the Day of Absence had been a tradition at Evergreen since the 1970s, and what would happen is non-white faculty and students would leave campus for the day, and this was to demonstrate how important they were to the university. But in 2017, the organizers decided to change it, and so they asked white faculty and students to leave instead. Weinstein objected to that. He said that it's different when a group decides to leave themselves to make a point, but asking another group of people to leave is an act of oppression in and of itself, he said. About 50 student protesters confronted him. They demanded that he stop supporting white supremacy, that he stop telling people of color they're useless. They cursed at him. At one point, they asked him for an explanation of his remarks and then wouldn't let him go on. He asked, "May I answer the question?" And they yelled, "No." Weinstein ended up holding classes off campus after the campus police told him they couldn't guarantee his safety. People put fire Brett graffiti around the campus and names and pictures of his students online. And after all this, Weinstein and his wife both left the college. She was also a faculty member there. And last year, Samuel Abrams at Sarah Lawrence College. Sarah Lawrence is a small liberal arts college about 15 miles north of Manhattan. And Abrams wrote an op-ed in the New York Times. And you can see the title here. I think professors are liberal tri-school administrators. And so in this piece, Abrams describes himself as conservative-leaning, and he points to some of the events that were put on at his school, so by the Office of Student Affairs. So one of the events was about microaggressions. Another one of them was called Understanding White Privilege. Another was called Stay Healthy, Stay Woke. And he describes these events as politically lopsided, and says that it's not just his own school, but many universities across the country have this kind of highly politicized socialization going on. And he says that while a lot of people have focused on the political skew among faculty, and they've worried about indoctrination again in the classroom, it's actually administrators who are more politically skewed than the faculty. And he presented data on this. So he conducted a survey of student-facing administrators. So these would be administrators whose work deals with students' experiences in housing and things like that. And he found a ratio of 12 liberals for every conservative, and this is compared to 6-to-1 for faculty and 2-to-1 for incoming students. So Abrams suggested that this is a problem. He said because of administrators' power in setting the agenda, they threaten the free exchange of ideas on campus, and that this is something especially needed in more politically polarized times. So that was his article, published in the New York Times, and the response, he talks about it here. People tried unsuccessfully actually to break into his office, but when they couldn't do that, they defaced the door. They wrote curses, messages cursing at him. They took down pictures of his family. Others, they demanded that he go teach somewhere else, maybe Charlottesville. This was after the alt-right riots at Charlottesville. There was an emergency meeting of the Student Senate to deal with the offending op-ed, and students called for him to be stripped of his tenure and fired. 6 months later, 6 months after this, a left-wing campus group called the Diaspora Coalition was still demanding that Abrams' tenure be reviewed. They wanted it to be reviewed by a panel of people from the Diaspora Coalition, and also including 3 faculty members of color. And more than 40 professors signed on to these demands from the Diaspora Coalition that Abrams' tenure be reviewed. So that's a case where there were even faculty involved in supporting the students, and that's true of a lot of these other cases too. Administrators and faculty may immediately side with and support student activists. So this happened in the Weinstein case I was just talking about. Shortly after those things happened, after the students surrounded Weinstein, cursed at him and so on, George Bridges, the president of Evergreen State, held a town hall meeting where he said that he was grateful to the courageous students who expressed their concerns, and he said that this was the catalyst to expedite the work to which we are jointly committed. Other faculty may even themselves join in denigrating those they see as oppressors or members of privileged groups. So Otto Warmbier was a University of Virginia student arrested while on a trip to North Korea, held in prison for 17 months, and he was sent home in such terrible condition, apparently from the abuse he received there, that he immediately died. Catherine Detwiller was a lecturer in anthropology at the University of Delaware, and she saw Warmbier as a privileged white male student who deserved it. So she posted on Facebook, "Is it wrong of me to think that Otto Warmbier got exactly what he deserved? I've spent my life teaching folks just like Otto, and Otto is typical of the mindset of a lot of the young, white, rich, clueless males who come into my classes." So if incivility often comes from the campus left, though, as we see in these examples, it's not unknown among the critics of the campus left either. Milo Yiannopoulos was a Breitbart reporter and for a while a frequent campus speaker who would come to campuses and denounce the campus activists, and praise Donald Trump. He would do this usually while wearing some costume, he dressed in drag on one occasion. On another occasion, he wore a bathrobe. Here he's in some kind of priest garb. And he was often called a provocateur because he seemed to deliberately provoke controversy by saying things guaranteed to provoke the activists on campus. So at one talk that was it actually ended up being canceled at UCLA. He'd given the talk the title, 10 Things I Hate About Mexico. So obviously, Yiannopoulos is a critic of campus culture, not embracing civility himself. So whether incivility is on campus, whether it's in mainstream politics, whether it comes from the left or whether it comes from the right, what I find more interesting about it than the fact that it occurs is the defenses of it. How do people justify demeaning others? How do they justify racist and other derogatory language? Why do other people support them in this? I find it interesting because when we see these kinds of defenses, we're seeing evidence not just of individual acts of incivility, but of a culture that promotes incivility, or at least that allows for it, that applauds it on certain occasions. So let's look at a couple of these defenses of incivility. The first one comes from the left. So Sarah Jang joined the New York Times editorial board in the summer of 2018, and there was a controversy about many of her past tweets. And these mainly were denigrating whites and men. The controversial tweets were in various ways. And so you can see here 3 examples of those: cancel white people, and so on. So these were the kinds of tweets that caused controversy, many people demanding that she be fired. But the New York Times initially supported her. They actually expressed regret over the tweets. They saw them as bad, but they stood by her, and she expressed some regret for the tweets. But there were other people who defended them more forthrightly. So at Vox, 2 writers, Ezra Klein and Zach Beauchamp, said that Jang's tweets weren't racist or sexist or uncivil. In fact, they meant quite innocuous things if only you understood them correctly. So Ezra Klein talked about, first of all, before talking about Jang specifically, he talked about how in his circles it had become popular in recent years to tweet with the hashtag #KillAllMen. So it sounds derogatory, kill all men, but of course he says these people didn't really want to kill all men, or any men. It was just, kill all men was just their way of saying it would be nice if the world sucked less for women. So it's the same with Jang, he said, right? So when she talks about white people, she's not talking about white people as such, she's talking about the dominant power structure. So then, the idea is that cancel white people would be about challenging the dominant power structure. Or when she says white men are BS, this is, she's satirically emphasizing how white people continue to benefit from their skin color, and this points to ways in which the power structure that favors white people continues to exist. Actually, the second is from Zach Beauchamp, who offers a similar kind of defense of Jang. So they're essentially retranslating, that she's simply kind of making a bigger critique about oppression and doing it in this kind of language. So the other tweet that I had up, this was Beauchamp's explanation of that, talking about white people marking up the internet like dogs. And so the way Beauchamp put it is that she's commenting on the ubiquity of white opinion on social media, and this is a way of pointing out how non-white voices often don't appear or get drowned out in social media discourse. So that's from the left. If we want to think about defenses of incivility coming from the right, there are those as well. And if we're looking for a similar kind of intellectual defense of the morality of incivility from the right, Sohrab Ahmari's First Things piece called Against David Frenchism might be the best recent example. So Ahmari's argument, it's more of a condemnation of certain kinds of civility or niceness, and he's using David French as an example. David French is a conservative who writes for National Review and somebody who's very anti-Trump. And so Ahmari starts out the piece saying, it isn't easy to critique the persona of someone as nice as French. But then again, he says, it's in part that earnest and incessantly polite quality of his that I find so unsuitable to the depth of the present crisis facing religious conservatives, which is why I recently quipped on Twitter that there is no polite David Frenchian third way around the cultural civil war. So he's arguing against French's civility, But his substantive point is that David French, although he's culturally conservative, like Amari, a religious conservative, he's politically liberal from Amari's standpoint in that he believes in American institutions. He believes in free speech. He believes in freedom of religion. And he sees these as the best path for getting along and the best path for protecting religious conservatives like himself and like Amari. But Amari says the left won't live with this, that the culture war can't be solved this way. So David French, he says, displays a kind of airy, above-it-all mentality. And he goes on, but conservative Christians can't afford these luxuries. Progressives understand that the culture war means discrediting their opponents and weakening or destroying their institutions. Conservatives should approach the culture war with a similar realism. Civility and decency are only secondary values. So now when Amari says civility and decency are only secondary values, notice that it's not that he thinks they're bad in and of themselves. And the campus activist and the uncivil politicians and others might say something similar. So it's a matter of emphasis. What's most important? And if we're thinking about moral variation more broadly, differences between societies, between groups, between individuals, about what they think is right and wrong, that's usually the kind of thing we're looking at. Moral trade-offs. Which virtues get prioritized? As much as different moral cultures clash with one another, with other people's ideas often seeming alien and even incomprehensible to us, but it's not usually the case that they're totally different at some fundamental level. It's not like one group values courage and honesty and justice and the other group values cowardice and dishonesty and injustice. It's usually that they emphasize different virtues over others. So this aspect of moral cultures, that it usually involves an emphasis on certain virtues rather than a disagreement about what is vice and virtue broadly, this is illustrated nicely in a science fiction novel called Divergent by Veronica Roth. This was also made into a film, and it portrays a kind of dystopian future where a community is divided into 5 factions, and each of these factions emphasizes a different moral virtue. So the factions are amity, erudite, candor, abnegation, dauntless, and the idea is that they were formed because people had different ideas about what was wrong with the world. So what was to blame for the world's problems? Some people thought it was aggression. They formed amity, and their virtue was kindness. Some people thought it was ignorance. They formed erudite, and they valued knowledge. Some people thought it was duplicity that was wrong with the world, and they formed candor, and their virtue was honesty. Some people thought what's wrong with the world is selfishness. They formed abnegation, and their virtue was selflessness. And then others thought that the problem with the world was cowardice. They formed dauntless, and their virtue was courage. So emphasizing a particular virtue then in these factions suits members of the different factions for different tasks. So the dauntless are the police, and the abnegation, because they're not prone to corruption, are the rulers. But it also leads each of the factions into conflicts with one another, and it causes problems within the group. So emphasizing courage, for instance, often leads the dauntless to be cruel. And emphasizing intelligence and the pursuit of knowledge often leads the erudite to arrogance. Now, obviously, this isn't a realistic portrayal of how a society might be organized, but what a lot of science fiction does is it presents things in an unfamiliar way. It presents even an unrealistic setting in order to point to features in our own world. And this is what this does. So if we look to our own world, we look to reality, we don't see moral factions divided in quite this way, but we do see different moral cultures emphasizing different virtues to different degrees and de-emphasizing others. So we could think of the Amish like abnegation, with lives centered around selflessness. We can think of many honor cultures of the past and the present as similar to the dauntless, centered around courage. So in honor cultures, courage or bravery, and especially physical courage, is emphasized over many other virtues. So we see honor cultures in a number of environments. The pre-Civil War American South was one where we saw honor culture among the elites there, where people might fight duels with one another. Modern gangs are another context where people retaliate for killings and there might be feud-like behavior back and forth between them. So we see it in different contexts and there are different manifestations of it. But one thing that's interesting is that what makes sense in an honor culture often doesn't make sense to outsiders. It may even seem absurd. Not all honor cultures have duels, but many of them do, and duels actually make little sense outside of an honor culture, so they illustrate this logic pretty nicely. So you see the picture there of a duel, men firing guns at one another. But why should two men shoot guns at each other because one of them has insulted the other? To outsiders, this can seem absurd, ridiculous. Say someone calls me a scoundrel or a liar, and I challenge him to a duel. He accepts, and then we take turns firing shots at each other. How does that prove I'm not a scoundrel or a liar? It doesn't, obviously, but it does prove I have courage, that I'm willing to face death, and so in the logic of the culture, it means I'm worthy of respect, and I've shown that. Honor is, among other things, one's reputation for courage, for physical bravery. And in an honor culture, it acts as a kind of moral status. You can lose it. You can lose your honor. And losing it will affect your social standing. So you better be vigilant about protecting it. So this ends up meaning in honor cultures, people are often very sensitive to slight, ready to perceive themselves as being slighted or insulted, even over small matters, and ready to react to it, sometimes violently. They're also sometimes very quick to insult other people, which has the advantage of showing they're not afraid of provoking someone else's violence, that they're not worried about getting into a violent conflict. Now, honor cultures were replaced by what some historians and sociologists have called dignity cultures. So in a dignity culture, the idea is that humans have an inherent worth regardless of their status. This is dignity. This means you don't have to be as vigilant about protecting your reputation. You know who you are. You know your value regardless of what other people say. So the idea is that in a dignity culture, if someone slights you, insults you, you can let it go. Have thick skin. Say, sticks and stones may break my bones, words will never hurt me. And then if somebody does injure you, there's a serious offense, if the sticks and stones, then you can call the police or you can use the courts. It also means that you shouldn't go around insulting other people because you should recognize their dignity. Just as you have dignity, so do they. So in 2013, I was discussing some of the moral claims by campus activists with Jason Manning, who's a sociologist at West Virginia University. And we began to think about the fact that the activist moral cultures weren't really like honor culture or dignity culture. They were using a different kind of moral framework. So we called the new culture victimhood culture, and we ended up describing this in the Rise of Victimhood Culture, which was published in 2018. And the idea, so the campus activists' answer to what's wrong with the world would be oppression and victimhood. Society is set up so that whites, men, straight people, cisgendered people, able-bodied people, and so on benefit, while people of color, women, LGBT people, the disabled, and so on suffer. So oppression and victimhood act as a kind of master framework for analyzing all, or at least most aspects of society. Even small interactions like conversations between members of an oppressor group and a victim group might further oppression. The reason we call this a victimhood culture is that the concern with fighting oppression leads victimhood to become a kind of moral status, just like honor is in an honor culture. Victimhood culture is in fact similar to honor cultures in its sensitivity to slight. But it's not the same kinds of slights, or at least they're not interpreted the same way. It's slights against members of victim groups by members of oppressor groups, and they're handled differently. In honor cultures, people want to demonstrate they can handle their conflicts themselves. They want to present themselves as strong. But in a victimhood culture, people appeal to authorities, to other third parties. And to some extent, this is a feature that victimhood culture shares with dignity culture. It's appeal to third parties. So like in dignity culture also, there's no shame in reporting crimes and going and using the courts. But unlike in dignity cultures, where you let small things go and you appeal to authorities only for bigger things, even small slights in a victimhood culture might be cause for concern and intervention. So just as dueling illustrates nicely the logic of honor culture and how it differs from other cultures, the idea of microaggression nicely illustrates the logic of victimhood culture. So you can see here, you might not be able to read, but this is a list of microaggressions used in faculty training at the University of California. And so it lists, the idea is that microaggressions are slights, perhaps even unintended ones, that further the oppression of a victimized group. And so at the top of there, asking someone where they're from, it says it might convey the idea that the person isn't a true American. Or saying America is a melting pot might convey the idea that minorities should assimilate into the dominant culture. So these are microaggressions, small offenses, but they're important, the idea is, because they add up over time. So you can see here the sensitivity to slight, and you can see that authorities, like campus administrators, sometimes involve themselves in them through training and other things. But if we're just thinking about that, about sensitivity to slight, about growing concern with that, about worries about microaggressions, it might seem odd that victimhood culture could produce incivility. If heightened sensitivity about oppression is a guiding principle, if even where are you from is offensive, why would the culture ever support slights, insults, and even racial slurs? So why would there be incivility rising from victimhood culture? And the answer is that everything is interpreted through the lens of oppression and victimhood. So that whether something is a microaggression depends on who makes the statement and whom it's directed toward. Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt are the authors of The Coddling of the American Mind, a book that came out in 2018. Earlier, there was an Atlantic article by the same title in 2015. And they talk about what they call vindictive protectiveness. So the effort to protect some people, like we see in a victimhood culture, is often combined with an extreme vindictiveness toward people they believe are harming them, right? So the effort to protect people from oppression leads to vindictiveness sometimes toward the oppressors. If you see the world the way many of the activists see it, people like Nicholas Christakis, like Brett Weinstein, like Samuel Abrams, aren't just people with different ideas, differing political views. They're people who are harming the oppressed by refusing to join in their struggle. So they're worthy of contempt. On the other hand, the racial invective of someone like Erica Jang isn't the same at all. It's directed against oppressors. It's a way of fighting oppression. Or at the very least, it's an understandable response to oppression, not something to be condemned. So this is one way that victimhood acts as a kind of status. It gives privileges to some people. Privileges to be uncivil, even to be hateful, while at the same time it challenges the right of others even to politely express contrary and fairly mainstream views. And remember, this isn't because the activists have some kind of radically different values. They don't hate civility. They also don't hate courage or any of the other values any of the other things people normally value. They just prioritize fighting what they see as oppression. They see the world differently, and they emphasize different virtues. What often comes with that, though, is what often happens when a moral culture emphasizes one virtue at the expense of others. There's a kind of moral emaciation where some moral concerns are given no attention, or if they are given attention, they're dealt with in other terms. They're reinterpreted. In this case, in a victimhood culture, people come to see concerns about oppression and victimhood as the whole of morality. It becomes a kind of master framework, And it might be hard to even understand virtues that have nothing to do with stopping oppression. Why should someone be civil to an oppressor? Why would they have rights? The very idea might seem preposterous to them. So victimhood culture threatens civility, as we've seen, and it can also threaten free speech and academic freedom, and again, it's for the same reason. What matters is whether the speech is uplifting the oppressed. If it's not, if it's causing them harm, the idea is it should be prevented, just as you'd prevent violence. But while victimhood culture might be the biggest threat to civility on campus, we've seen that it's not just on campus, and it's not just from the left that we're seeing incivility. And in fact, some of the biggest opponents of victimhood culture are often rude and uncivil themselves. So why is that? It's because their opposition to victimhood culture often isn't coupled with an embrace of dignity. Sometimes they embrace their own form of victimhood. If they embrace victimhood, this leads to many of the same effects. They might see themselves as oppressed or fighting those who would like to oppress them. We saw this to some extent with Sohrab Ahmari criticizing David French. And some on the right don't just embrace victimhood, they embrace offensiveness. They might want to trigger the snowflakes and things like that. This was Milo Yiannopoulos' strategy. But remember that moral cultures don't usually have completely different values. They have different ideas about which values to emphasize. So if you're simply reacting to the culture you oppose by doing the opposite, that's usually going to lead you into a new kind of morality altogether. In this case, deliberately being offensive isn't any more compatible with dignity culture than victimhood culture is. Dignity culture counsels against both taking offense and against deliberately causing offense. Now that might seem incompatible, but only if you assume a world in which perfection is possible, where there aren't any moral trade-offs. Avoiding taking offense, actually might allow offense to flourish. But if you assume people will always have conflicts, there will always be things people are offended about, you might try to encourage peace, not to eliminate conflict, but to reduce it. So if you come from that standpoint, then there's nothing incompatible at all about avoiding taking offense and causing offense. They're both about treating people charitably. They both allow for errors to occur, and they won't eliminate conflict, but they will help minimize it. Departures from civility, though, whether it's being quick to take offense or quick to cause offense, whether it's from the right or left, are likely to maximize conflict. So maybe there's still a place for dignity culture. Certainly it would seem like the most promising path forward for those wanting to pursue social change while still remaining civil, while still remaining respectful in word and deed, being respectful toward those you disagree with, is to embrace dignity culture. But this is also what makes dignity unattractive to many activists who don't want to accept a world of disagreement, who don't want limits imposed on their pursuit of justice. So Thomas Sowell, in his book, A Conflict of Visions, talks about the constrained and unconstrained visions of politics. Stephen Messenger, who's written several online articles at REO and elsewhere, has borrowed this framework from Sowell, and he argues that it's this conflict between visions that's at the root of all or nearly all of the important political controversies today, including that between victimhood and dignity cultures. Now, I don't think I would go that far, but I would say that dignity culture is compatible with the constrained vision, with the idea that not everything is possible, with the idea that there are limits to what we can achieve through politics, and that there are trade-offs in morality and politics. The idea of dignity means that however wrong someone is, whatever they've done, they have the same basic human worth as you do. Putting this idea in practice usually means that when we go about trying to change the world, even if we're trying to make a world where more people are treated with dignity, we have to go about that with a certain humility. people who disagree with us might be wrong, but they might not be evil. They might simply be misguided. Humility also means recognizing they might be right, or they might even be evil, but they still have dignity. And we still treat them as if they have dignity, just as we do. So if you're abandoning that, even if you're doing so ostensibly in pursuit of dignity, you begin to develop a different kind of moral culture. The idea of dignity naturally constrains some of our plans. It's going to temper our passions. That doesn't mean that dignity prevents activism. It's not incompatible with pursuing social justice. If it were, it wouldn't have played such a big role in the civil rights movement, with Martin Luther King Jr. counseling civil rights activists to love their enemies, to love their oppressors. And this was where oppression and victimhood were very stark and very severe. But oppression wasn't all there was, and Martin Luther King, with a morality of dignity rooted in his Christian faith, believed that oppressors had dignity too. And he believed that hatred on the part of the oppressed would do them more harm than good. So dignity culture can be compatible with activism. It can be compatible with pursuing social justice. And actually many of those movements have mainly been driven by it. But at the same time, it is incompatible with some forms of activism, with some ideas about social justice. So what Sowell calls the unconstrained vision is the idea that human nature and human societies are infinitely malleable, that they're perfectible. No evil deed need ever be tolerated, certainly not in the long run. We can eliminate it. So radical movements that embrace this unconstrained vision might also share ideas about dignity, but they don't share the idea that dignity means restraint, that it means charity toward those who might be wrong, that it means it's not possible to achieve all political goals, and that it means that the pursuit of perfection can lead to horrors. Incivility isn't the worst of those horrors. So the kinds of things we're talking about, rude behavior, comments, hate speech even, it's not the worst thing possible. It's not Auschwitz. It's not the Gulag. But if you're concerned about incivility, if you want more civil discourse on campus, in politics, and elsewhere, then embracing a culture of dignity is probably the best way to go about it. Thank you. Sure. Yes.
Hi. There was a term that you used, I thought very interesting, cultural civil war. Can you give a little more context of what you mean by that? And if people are using leveraging insults as a weapon in that war, do you think that's effective?
What's meant by cultural civil war, and if people are using insults, is that effective? Okay, so that was actually, that was a quote from Sohrab Ahmari in the article where he was criticizing David French. And so I think of that as more, he's defending, that's his defense of incivility, and it's one kind of defense of it. So he was saying that there is a cultural civil war, that religious conservatives in this case are under assault, and that simply trying to have neutral public spaces, his idea was that David French and other people like him who just thought, oh, we can have free speech, we can have freedom of religion, and we need to be vigilant about pursuing that, and respecting our opponents and all that kind of thing. He thinks that's a losing strategy because he thinks that their opponents will not respect it. They won't come to terms. There's a civil war going on, and one side will win. So that was his idea, that there's this cultural civil war, that the ordinary kind of American institutions that would provide space for people to disagree aren't going to be effective. And so he was arguing for religious conservatives to fight the war in the sense that, to not try to make compromises and to make a neutral public sphere, but to actually win out the way that he says that their enemies are. Whether it's effective, whether he's right is one thing, right? Whether there is this kind of civil war. We certainly see kind of when you see more extremism from both sides, and more polarization on both sides, that's part of what's feeding into incivility in politics. And there is, I guess, the possibility that one side wins out. There would be then the question of whether, not just whether they're effective in winning some kind of political battle, but are they actually effective in achieving their goals? Is it going to produce the kind of society that either wants, right? A harmonious society, or one where people can live out their lives in the way that they want. I think that would be the issue. I think like a lot of people who take extreme positions in politics take them as if you just make political decisions in a vacuum, as if like what would be in some ideal world the best policy, or what would be the best policy if everybody agreed with me, without kind of any kind of realistic plan for convincing other people, right? So I don't think that incivility is a winning political strategy in that sense, in the sense of making a better world, which I assume is what most activists actually want. Although that doesn't mean it won't win elections in very polarized times. Yes.
So I'm aware that a lot of this conversation is in the realm of student activism, but I truly believe that a lot of student activism kind of intersects with the rise of online activism as well. I was wondering if you were aware of the kind of controversy that's currently going on with Ella's comments regarding the conversation and the seeding friendship that she had with George Bush, and how she sort of was saying, like, we prioritize being kind. A lot of the online activism community lashed out by saying that, this is humanizing George Bush, and although, yes, niceness is a priority that we should have, a lot of times it's used to silence voices, like you've talked about in this conversation. I was just wondering, what are your thoughts on this whole thing?
Yes, I saw that controversy going on, and these things are always kind of happening, right? That and I just briefly read it, so I think your summary, that sounds right to me. But but the idea that Ellen is being criticized, Ellen DeGeneres being criticized for her friendship with George W. Bush, and then she defended that, saying, "Oh, I can of course be friends with people I disagree with," which most of us would probably, that's the kind of behavior you would normally think of as virtuous, right? Being able to get along with people across different, different, who have different political views, across ethnic lines, all kinds of things like that. And it would go into that civility thing, right? Like we can still be civil and disagree, even very strongly. But of course, then some of the activists online are saying, no, of course you can't. Why would you? You can't be friends with somebody who's evil, I guess. It's you're right that the online activism is driving a lot of us. This is something we talk about a little in the book, touching on kind of some of the causes of what we think of as the rise of victimhood culture, and new technologies are certainly part of it, and I think part of incivility in other realms as well, kind of like from the right and stuff as well too. That you have. Twitter activists can be very small in number, and their voices can get amplified. They end up getting reported, and often, often news articles now just report tweets, and they're often not even tweets by people with a lot of followers or people who are well known and stuff. And so that's, on the one hand, it's kind of democratizing things where everybody has a chance to sort of be heard, but it also means that you're amplifying views that aren't necessarily representative, right? So that, I'm sure if you took polls, most people would have no idea that controversy exists. If they did, they wouldn't necessarily think you can't be friends across political boundaries and things like that. But it does it amplifies certain voices, and I think it has an effect not just in the campus controversies, but increasingly in politics too, in a presidential primary and things like that. So, and I think that it's also part of the story about the rise of this kind of new moral culture is about the rise online. There's there's a wonderful book called Kill All Normies that charts the rise of what I call victimhood culture, but this kind of new culture, and also the alt-right. So the alt-right was also developing online at 4chan and places like that, while the social justice movement was developing these ideas at Tumblr and these other places. And so there was this, kind of around the same time, this movement on the far right and toward the far left, with obviously very different ideas from one another, but some of the same processes helping give rise to it. And it's partly because it's able to people are able to find others who agree with them and develop these ideas, and even when they start out more marginal. And so I think if you're looking at why this is all happening now, even though most of the trends have been there for a long time in certain, but technology is a big part of the story, I think. Yes.
So, what's under the assumption of the thought that perfection may lead to, or the pursuit of perfection may lead to the truth? How does one, if one is an activist, decide when to stop pushing?
So, if the pursuit of perfection can be a problem, that at the extreme it leads to horrors like the Gulag. How do we know if somebody is involved in activism? If you want to make the world a better place, how do you know when's the stopping point? When do you all evils? Because they're all. But what the activists would say is that there's always going to be somebody saying we can't do this, that, and they're right about that. And that's the thing. I think when I talk about dignity culture, or even about the constrained vision, kind of that can go along with that, it's not some comprehensive plan for designing a society. It's not a big political program. It can. A lot of political, you can have a lot of political differences and a lot of different ideas about how to organize the world and about what aims to achieve within this dignity culture framework. And I think so. It's not that there's going to be a formula for knowing that. But it's knowing that it's a possibility. That it's not just always, it's not always just the case that. That we could actually change the world in any way we want, but then people are just are trying to stop us because they're self-interested. It's that there really are constraints. There is human nature. There are sociological facts that can't be just wished away. So how do we know? I mean, coming from standpoint of morality, I was talking to a friend recently about just. To me, it doesn't seem like, and this isn't just about the left or about campus activists, but the virtue of prudence, what people would have thought of as prudence, as caution in things, as kind of a good judgment about knowing when to pursue actions and when not. I don't know that virtue in general is talked about as much, but I don't think you hear as much about that or even have any awareness when people are talking about different policies, whether it's war or immigration or taxes or whatever it is. The idea that there are always limits to your policies, and to try to understand what those limits are. There's not a magic formula, but part of it, I think, would be trying to understand what the world actually is like. So I think social science has a big role to play with that. And I think it's unfortunate when social scientists simply become political activists, because then they're not providing that kind of knowledge that can help people understand what's possible and what's not.
A lot of the quotes that you showed us earlier had to do with racial justice. And earlier the conversation about George Bush not being allowed, basically, with this new moral framework, to be friends of the Degeneres. In my experience, it's been reflected a lot between racial boundaries and then coming back up. Just earlier this week was the 55th anniversary of desegregation in the United States. But in my experience as a student, there have been more and more situations where you're expected to self-segregate based on race, because one race is seen as a victimized race and the other race is seen as an oppressive race. And at the same time, there have even been situations of explicit resegregation where organizations have said that people who are white, and especially white cisgender males, are not welcome to certain events anymore. Do you think that this is a widespread issue, and do you think that this has the capacity to spread off of college campuses?
I think it seems to be increasing, like the incidents that you're talking about. It's also, it's one of those things that can seem so bizarre to people who aren't familiar with this, that I think people who are not really connected with campuses and see what's going on a lot of times, and this is why you see, I don't always approve of, the language they use, snowflakes and all this kind of stuff, referring to people, and it can be uncivil itself, but they're often just shocked by it, and I think that's the sort of thing. If people look and they say, what's happening on campus, that they're resegregating, and of course, the intention, as you know, isn't, it's different from the segregation in like the pre-civil rights American South, which was based on the idea, that was based on the idea that blacks were inferior and keeping them away from whites, and the other is based, this newer form would be giving blacks or people of color their own spaces so that they're not oppressed by microaggressions and things like that. So I think it's good to have understanding of where people are coming from and what the logic of it is, and that's always important, because it's not just that they're sort of crazy, but you can see how this logic can play out to have effects that then are very much like what we might have been arguing against. And I think that's part of what concerns me, and I think aside from any kind of moral judgment on my own part, just in thinking about what are the goals of the activists, and are they actually going to achieve them through these policies? Now, presumably, they don't actually want to, in some kind of have some long-term plan, resegregate people and separate people along racial boundaries. They're presumably trying to fight oppression, what they see as oppression, and they want more racial harmony. They want more justice for people. They want less inequality, systematic inequality between groups. But will they achieve it through these policies? And that's where I think skepticism would be called for, and the idea that they might be working against what are their own goals. Yeah.
So in reading your book, my impression was that you were more pessimistic than you seem like you are today. That you say a few times in your book, well, I don't really think this is going to go further. Like this movement has a sort of momentum that's unstoppable, or maybe escalating. What do you think? Have you changed your opinion? What do you see for the future? Are you optimistic?
I don't think I've changed my opinion. I think it's mainly that I'm not a very gloomy person personally, but so I don't know that so maybe I am pessimistic in the sense that I have my doubts about the effectiveness of various efforts to stop this, to deal with this. I mean, this is, the Freedom Project is wonderful. Heterodox Academy. There are other kinds of organizations that are very well-meaning and doing good work. I mean, what can you do other than to try and you can still be effective in sort of more less ambitious goals. But are we going to turn the universities around and stop all this? Is it going to the problems, the censorship, and not just overt censorship, but people self-censoring, being afraid to talk about things, being afraid to have conversations about very ordinary topics. Is that going away anytime soon? I probably don't see it. Yeah, so I don't think that I still think. I guess the challenge would be. So one of the things I talk about in the book is kind of the social conditions that have led to the rise of victimhood culture. And it's partly that it's arising in environments that are actually very diverse and equal. So like first at elite college campuses and places like that, where there's a morality there that favors diversity and equality. So people are very concerned with anything that would go against that in any way. So you've got a group of people who are already committed mostly to to equality between groups, to having a lot of diversity. So offenses against diversity and equality, things that they see as oppression, even if they're more minor, then play, kind of loom large in terms of what they see as big problems. And then let the logic play out, and then you end up censoring speakers because they might be furthering people's oppression and these kinds of things. Well, if victimhood culture has arisen because of equality and diversity, but we still value equality and diversity for various other reasons, and that's just is part of the reason, then the challenge is, how do you have a different kind of moral culture? How do you, preserve dignity culture? And that doesn't mean there can't be change within that basic framework, but how do you preserve dignity culture in an environment of that's very diverse and very equal? How do you have an environment where people are diverse and treated with respect and equality, but also where people can argue and disagree, one that's intellectually diverse as well, and where people can be offended? I think of, and I think when we're thinking about differences in morality, even different settings in our own lives, some of them allow more leeway for offense than others. So you might think of, at the extremes, maybe a kindergarten class and a comedy club, right, in terms of what kinds of things you can say. And it's not that the university should be a comedy club, but maybe not a kindergarten class either, right? And so that how do you have debate about intellectual ideas? How do you have intellectual discoveries and things without acknowledging that some people will be offended by it? There's always offense, there's always disagreement in those conditions. And so the challenge is to be able to do that, to be able to provide an environment of freedom, of robust debate, that's also one that's diverse and equal. And I don't think that's impossible. So I think thinking through it and trying to learn ways to do that is the best thing to do. It's just that because I tend to see that moral cultures reflect the social structures that they're part of, I think it's a bigger task than just trying to change people's minds. I think you are next, or yeah.
Following up on the question, so as a person who puts dignity culture as the primary virtue, how do you approach a conversation with somebody who doesn't? For instance, somebody who puts political opinions or political senses as a priority in their virtue, how do you approach that conversation?
So how do you have conversations with people across moral cultures? That's also a challenge. I think if you are wanting to, if you're trying to embrace dignity, you have to be civil toward people. One thing you don't do is what we've seen from some opponents of victimhood culture, where you just begin insulting and mocking people. And maybe there's a place for insults and mockery in other places in life, but not, I don't think, it's not effective if you're trying to reach people, change their minds. And it's also, if the idea is that you should be charitable toward people and respect them, then you would want to understand where they're coming from and not simply mock them. Understand what moral concerns are driving them, and that doesn't mean it will work. There's not a formula that's going to make people not be offended by you. So how to have fruitful conversations. You could, I guess, my hope is always that explaining the difference in logic and where people are coming from would help people to be more respectful of other people, but that might not always be the case.
So if you deal with the basic shift from victimhood culture to dignity, and so framework for dignity culture is not taking offense of
isn't that a little, I don't know, like it sort of treats this cultural shift like a strategic choice. It seems like it's, to me, it's more a lack of the alternative because there is not a choice.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, so the idea is that the dignity cultures had replaced honor culture. So it's, you know, if most of us recognize that honor culture makes a lot of sense to the people in those societies, but and that it makes sense in an environment where you don't have effective legal systems, for instance, and you need to make sure that people know that you're not to be messed with, and that you have physical courage and that you're able to fight, and can make it. So it's not that any culture doesn't make sense for the people, but we can also kind of stand outside it and look and see, like, well, if we could change that, then it would be good to. And honor culture did get changed, and it changed along with structural changes like more effective legal systems. But at the same time, people were giving sermons, condemning duels, and doing all kinds of other things, condemning the honor culture ideas, right? So, so when we think about, you know, how do we, so if there's been this move in certain areas of society from dignity culture to victimhood culture, and that if it's true, I mean, if it's true that kind of stepping outside of that, you can see that it is causing problems, you know, in the sense, and I'm not necessarily, you know, arguing against it. I'm actually saying that it doesn't it's unlikely, just as an empirical matter, to create less conflict between people. So I think if that's one of your goals, to improve relations between people, you're probably not achieving that. So how do you then go, you know, from if dignity culture is partly about avoiding giving unnecessary offense and avoiding taking offense, does avoiding taking offense kind of assume the respect, you know, that they're fighting for? In a sense, it does, but that it's always the case that if you're avoiding taking offense, there are people who are actually being offensive towards you. You know, it's when people are cautioned to be thick-skinned. It's not that no one is ever criticizing or insulting them. The idea is that, you know, you'll be better off, and we'll all be better off if you don't let things get to you as much. And if people are making an argument that certain contexts or certain kinds of offense make that impossible, that's an argument to be made, but it's not. But I think, like, the alternative is just to question, well, maybe that's not right. Maybe the idea of not taking offense, not taking offense easily, treating people charitably, assuming their good intentions, maybe it does usually work out, and maybe there's not a big reason to change it. So I don't have, you know, like moral answers, like definitive moral answers here. It's more kind of an exploration of, I certainly, you know, personally would be more in favor of more on the dignity culture lines. Again, but I want to emphasize that it's not itself a comprehensive framework. The key would be to develop, if you're wanting to pursue social justice and things like that, to try to figure out ways to do that without causing these kinds of problems. It's a good point, and it's also, you can see then the challenge you face, because if people make different assumptions about what are the biggest problems and what kinds of things to prioritize, then they might come out differently. And again, that would go to the idea that I said, it's very seldom the case that people have completely different ideas about right and wrong. It seems like it, because in specific incidents they do, but usually they're emphasizing one thing or the other, and there's nothing to stop people from saying, well, we should in this environment emphasize not offending people, right? So it's if you want to prioritize that over other things.
I'm thinking about gay men and women in the 1950s, And they, well, especially King and his African-American followers, white supporters, they believed that it was incumbent upon them to be uncivil in order to protest against the victimhood culture to which they had been forced, obliged to live. You mentioned King, but would you agree he was very disruptive and challenging and defiant in his sit-ins, his demonstrations, in his outspokenness about segregation, and then later about the Vietnam War? I'm wondering if maybe there's more complexity to the relationship between civility and incivility and social justice than you have allowed in your argument.
I'm sure there's more complexity. I think, it's not that King wasn't disruptive and that his supporters weren't, and that's why I was saying that you can draw from the dignity framework, and there's still a place for activism, and there's still a place for engaging in behavior that might offend others. But I think there was there were huge differences in so King was actually telling people. So the idea wasn't that they were denigrating people and they weren't they were nonviolent. This kind of the nonviolence, the respect they were showing for the people who were arresting them, even, and things like that. There was this constant counsel to not be provoked, right? To not respond in kind when they were mistreated, and that's kind of drawing, and it's even more extreme than where it's like violence and other kinds of things being used against them, and I see that as drawing from this framework of dignity and the other cultures too. So it's I see what I'm calling victimhood culture as more than just asking to be treated with dignity, which is what those were saying. Like, these are our cultural ideals, but they're not being realized, right? That these are, people have these, and that's why they were able to, often why they were able to convince people, through their behavior and the nonviolence and stuff, because people already, to some extent, shared the moral framework that of dignity, but it wasn't a reality that, at least in parts of the country and in some people's lives and things like that. So. There are always more complexities to things than I can kind of cover. That you always lose some complexity when you try to describe things. But I don't see Martin Luther King or other civil rights activists at the time as drawing from what we've called victimhood culture. They were demanding ordinary legal kinds of protections, and to be treated with dignity and respect, and they were treating their enemies and even people who were very overtly oppressing them, treating them with dignity as well. That doesn't mean that they were never offended by them, but it wasn't because they weren't cursing at them and certainly not using violence. Not that nobody was, but that was the counsel they were given and the encouragement.
Actually, my question goes on the same lines. So do you think the continued kind of insistence on civility and niceness to some degree leads to an action? Because the way I see it, like, we are civil because we want to, have some sort of compromise, right? But compromise isn't what uproots systems like racism, right? It's civil disobedience. It's getting to the root of the issue and getting rid of it. I feel like sometimes being so focused on being civil distracts from the actual goal, and that is dismantling oppressive systems.
So the question is, does focusing on being civil distract from the goal of dismantling oppressive systems? And I think, again, moral debates are often about which things to emphasize over others, and that's certainly a position that you could take, that when faced with oppression, we throw dignity out, right? Or not, and it's not that we don't like dignity or think it's good for us, it's not always bad, and maybe it's good in some situations, but so it is a matter of how to balance things out. What I'm pointing out is that, actually first is just I'm pointing out that this kind of framework, analyzing things as oppression, which could be, nobody disagrees that there's oppression, but is oppression a master framework for analyzing all social relations, or can oppression be situational? Can it change from one context to the other? Who is the oppressor and who is the oppressed? I mean, there are different ways of analyzing that. So taking kind of one framework and analyzing it that way, and seeing the major goal as fighting oppression, can easily, as I was saying, lead to incivility, and for those reasons, because you are prioritizing other things. So the question, would be, I guess, to ask, activists who would be concerned with justice and who would be worried about, whether embracing civility will distract them from that, is, are you really accomplishing anything? So if people may simply have disagreements about the way the world works, or about what the biggest problems are, or what virtues to emphasize over others, but you could still ask the question is, does incivility accomplish that much? I mean, certainly, and that's where you get into the idea of, it's not that you're never disruptive. So people have done, pursued political activism, they were called all kinds of names and that kind of thing. But Martin Luther King Jr.'s idea was you could do that while still respecting your enemies, and loving them even, and doing it in a different way, and actually being more effective because you were nonviolent, because you were respectful, and so on, and more effective in the long run. So it's partly an empirical question. Does the incivility actually help? Does does using slurs against people and mocking them and calling them names advance the cause of social justice? I would, and I think the same thing with, and that's what Sohrab Ahmari, from the other kind, a very different point of view, is saying about religious conservatism. He says we don't have the luxury of being civil. Well, is incivility getting them anywhere, right? So it's not, and I think, like, again, it's my sense is that it doesn't. There's the moral question of whether it's okay to be uncivil to people. There's also the question of whether it's effective, and I think both of those things have to be addressed. I don't have an answer to any kind of certain answer of whether it's effective. Things can play out politically in different ways, but I suspect not.
We should give you a break on that note of uncertainty. Thank you very much.
Thank you.